I have a small confession to make. After completing the main story of the Elder Scrolls Arena, I really wasn't looking forward to Daggerfall. I was, then I wasn't, then I was again. It was a whole thing. I think Arena's outdated, difficult gameplay, mixed with the lack of story, was enough to put me off from the next installment. Getting through those dungeons took me a really long time. Then, figuring out how to write about each one and describing my adventures to the audience was even more challenging. I remembered the emotional roller coaster that Arena put me through, and I thought, I want to hold off as long as I can before I do that again. Well, you know what? Enough time has passed. It's finally time to slip on those Dwemer boots and to pull up those elven pauldrons. In today's video, I wanted to begin my journey through the main story of the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall. While I'll get into it later in the video, let's just say I already went through those emotional roller coasters. However, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's all thanks to you folks. As you can probably tell from the gameplay, I played both Daggerfall Classic and Daggerfall Unity. Why that is what's going to be talked about later. But for now, here's the rundown. I'm going to go through the game's main story from the beginning to the end. I'm going to discuss the story, read the dialogue, and detail my experiences while playing Daggerfall. I'll mostly talk about things that are relevant to the story, but to help you understand this massive world, I'll also detail other features of the game that helped me through my journey. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the story of the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall. I started out my playthrough in Daggerfall Classic. Why not begin with Unity? Well, honestly, I don't have a good reason, but switching to Unity afterwards, there are too many reasons to count. For now, I'd like to think of Classic as showing you what the game looked and operated like back in the day. Daggerfall begins like many other Elder Scrolls titles, with the character creation menu. Now, small spoiler, but this isn't the character I ended up going with. It's very similar, but with Unity, I made small adjustments to their overall build. Similar to Arena, I started out by selecting a home province from the map of Tamriel. Again, orcs and Imperials are nowhere to be found here. For my character's race, I decided to go with the Redguards of Hammerfell. I knew I wanted another melee-focused character. I'm just not skilled enough to use magic and to maintain my bars in these older games. Next came picking a class. Deciding to choose from the pre-existing selection, I went with the rather vanilla Knight class. I read that the problems I had dealt with as a warrior in Arena would have been solved if I had instead gone with a Knight. While that was true, being a Knight came with its own set of problems, so the grass wasn't always greener. Up next, I filled out a small questionnaire that was meant to help build my character's background. These were questions like what motivated me into a life of adventure and what nickname I had as a child. At the end though, it didn't have any influence on my reputations with any of the game's NPCs. After naming my character and selecting their face, it was then time for a very important part of the creation process, adding bonus points. I had 14 additional points to throw into my attributes. At the time, I was mistaken on which ones would benefit me as a knight, and that's probably one of the reasons that led to my early downfall. I tossed a bunch into strength, a fair bit into endurance, a little bit into luck, and one into willpower. For reference, I mainly tried to use the long blades. Those are governed by agility, and I didn't really touch that attribute at all. So you can probably guess how that went. Then finally, for the bonus points section, there was adding additional points into my skills. A knight's primary skills are Longblade, Etiquette, and Blunt Weapon. Etiquette was a bit of a waste for this character, and it's something that I threw out the window for my adjusted playthrough. Next, my major skills were Axe, Archery, and Shortblade. To be honest, for my personal taste, there were too many weapon options. I would have preferred one of them in my primary and two in my major. This way, other skills could have gone into the remaining slots, but that's something that gets tweaked later. Then lastly, my minor skills were Medical, Dodging, hand-to-hand, jumping, swimming, and climbing. As you can probably tell, there are a lot of skills in the earlier Elder Scrolls games that get consolidated and or taken out by the future installments. Finally, the very last selection for Daggerfall was picking my preferred reflexes. The higher I went, the faster the gameplay. The lower I went, the slower everything would be. Deciding to go with the average setting, I looked over my character sheet one last time and then got sent into the world of Daggerfall.
400 years after Tiberseptimus' reign, the beginning will meet the end, and the bloody circle will close in the empire of Tamriel. The unworthy heirs of the Septim dynasty have allowed the bonds of the empire to weaken and crack. Uriel Septim, the Seventh, cannot repair what his ancestors ignored. The provinces fight among themselves like neglected children, drunk with rebellion, and one indomitable power hides itself, but not forever.
Excuse the gloom, but none may know of this meeting. The nature of my trouble is darker still. Over a year ago, King Lysandus of Daggerfall died honorably on the field of battle. He was as loyal a subject, ally, and friend as you are. I did grieve for him, but his spirit does not rest. With a spectral army, he haunts his former kingdom, crying for revenge. I do not know why a good and loyal man would be so cursed. Perhaps you can find the answer and close the marble jaws of oblivion, bringing peace to his soul. I ask this as your emperor and your friend. I have one lesser request. Several years ago, I wrote a letter to the Queen of Daggerfall. It never arrived. The letter was of a sentimental and personal nature. If you find and destroy that letter, I will be grateful. Now, my champion, rest well this night, for tomorrow you sail for the kingdom of Daggerfall.
As the scene cuts away, I'm presented with a small notice regarding my character's whereabouts and condition. I've woken up and am disoriented. Not long ago, I was on a boat destined for Daggerfall. Out of nowhere, this intense storm crawled through the Iliac Bay and destroyed the ship. Luckily, I was able to reach land and I took refuge in a cave. Unfortunately, after setting up a small camp, a mudslide occurred and it closed off the cave's entrance. It appears that the only way out is through the cavern. Once I'm free of this dungeon, I can officially begin the Emperor's Quest. Finally, the gameplay starts up. The dungeon I'm currently in is called Privateer's Hold. It's meant to get me acquainted with Daggerfall's mechanics, features, and controls. It teaches me how to move around and interact with the world. I learned how to access my inventory and how to navigate through the different tabs and their functions. It also instructs me on how to fight and how to hold my ground against enemies. All things considered, Privateer's Hold is actually a decent dungeon. The enemy types range from rats, imps, and bats to humans, mer, and skeletons. There are enemies that I could squash rather easily, and some that beat me down over and over again. The loot was also plentiful, as there were treasure piles and corpses to take from. What's more, Privateer's Hold is larger than a lot of the other dungeons in the game. Obviously, it pales in comparison to the game's latter dungeons, but there are a lot of one-off crypts, vaults, and graveyards that only have a couple of rooms and one long hallway. Privateer's Hold is maze-like, has plenty of nooks to stick your head into, and as previously mentioned, there are a variety of enemies in here. Switching gears a bit, as you could tell, the UI and controls are very similar to Arena's. That's actually one of the reasons why I was hesitant to start my Daggerfall playthrough. I'm not used to using the keyboard and mouse in that way, and I couldn't remember all of the features on the menu. Everything about it is stiff and slow. Even during the latter hours of my Arena playthrough, I still wasn't fully comfortable with the controls. Fortunately, that's something that Unity fixes, and in fact, makes it incredibly fun. Now, having run this dungeon probably around 10 times due to my first impressions video, this is the one and only area I knew my way around. I knew which doors to go through and which ways to turn. Because of that, I was able to find the exit pretty quickly. Successfully escaping Privateer's Hold, the world of Daggerfall was now my oyster. The game takes place in northern Hammerfell, southern High Rock, and a handful of islands in the Iliac Bay. Amazingly, Daggerfall's world is already preloaded, so it is possible to walk to your destination. However, the wilderness and uninhabited areas are fairly barren, so you'll either end up lost or extremely bored. Furthermore, it would take you a really long time to get to the other regions, let alone a town that's in the same district. That's of course why fast traveling exists. By choosing a region, I'm able to manually select where I'd like to travel to. There are filters at the bottom that can help me hone in on towns, dungeons, temples, etc. Additionally, there's also a feature to search for my desired location. This is obviously the easiest way to go about traveling if you have a certain spot in mind. From here, I'm able to select specifics for my journey. Depending on what I choose, it affects the cost of my trip, the total travel time, and the time of day I arrive at said location. In the grand scheme of the story, all these details matter, and they've ended up costing me several quest completions. As per the game's suggestion, I set my sights on the city of Daggerfall. Arriving, I was quickly acquainted with the game's city life. Citizens carried on with their daily routines. Speaking with them, I could inquire about all sorts of things. Directions to all the stores, guild halls, temples, taverns, and the royal castles. If it came up in conversation, I could ask about specific people, and they could point me in the direction of work, or side quests as it's more commonly known as. Within the city itself, I found the nearest tavern, rested for a day, and continued my exploration. Pretty soon into my travels, another notice popped up. A courier approached my character and handed him a letter. The courier then left as quickly as they came. Taking a peek at the note, it reads, "Dear Bard, I heard about your accident at sea and fear the worst. Now that I've heard you're alive and well, I would like the opportunity to meet with you and discuss our beloved Emperor's mission in the Iliac Bay. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Lady Magnuson, the Emperor's agent in the court of Daggerfall. My position is not so official as an ambassador. None but other agents of the Emperor know of my true affiliation. The Iliac Bay is rife with rebels against the Imperial throne, so your discretion is required. For the purpose of our meeting, I will take a room at the inn, the Beaver and Helm, in Horley of Daggerfall for a month. After that, I will no longer be available. I'll expect you as soon as possible. Yours sincerely, Brisienna, Lady Magnuson." Now, as I've said before, time is of the essence with a lot of these missions. If you fail to meet with Brisienna, she gives you one more chance, but the other quests aren't so forgiving. What's more, with a handful of them, failure to meet with specified deadlines results in the main quest becoming unbeatable. So, when someone tells you to do something by a certain time, it's best to get it done ASAP. Real quick, before heading to Horley, I wanted to finish up with the topics of cities and settlements. Daggerfall cities are rather large. They're filled with all sorts of establishments and people. However, in turn, they're not very unique. Yes, the designs and builds vary depending on where you are in the region, but for the most part, they offer the same services and interactions. Speaking of which, by popping open the map, I'm able to see which buildings offer specific services. There are plenty of shops, a fair bit of taverns, and a handful of halls. Now, towns/settlements are of course different from cities. Horley, for example, is much smaller than Daggerfall. It only contains one tavern, and it only has 2 or so stores. However, as we know, towns can serve as locations for quests, and they offer the player a chance for a quick, safe, and easy layover while out on their grand expeditions. Now, as for the quest at hand, Brisienna's meeting location is actually randomized, and it could be any of the settlements local to the Daggerfall region. My guess is that it's meant to ease the player into the game's strict travel times. I personally went with the most economic travel option to Horley and still made it there with 27 days to spare. From the town's exterior, it didn't take me long to find the Beaver and Helm. Heading on inside, I stumbled upon Lady Magnuson standing within the main chamber. Speaking with her, she relayed some important information to my character. Lady Brisienna thanked me for coming and introduced herself. She then got me up to speed on what's been happening around here. Apparently, the ghost of King Lysandus haunts the streets at night. Unfortunately, he's unwilling to communicate with anyone. He does moan the word vengeance, but no one really knows why. Brisienna warns me not to wander the city at night, as I'll likely be attacked by his legion of ghosts. Instead, the lady recommends that I start my investigation by looking into those who could have wronged Lysandus in life. The most prominent families in this region of Tamriel are the Royals of Daggerfall, Wayrest, and Sentinel. As for the Emperor's secondary quest, Brisienna then goes on to discuss the details, or lack thereof, regarding the letter. Apparently, the Emperor's agent wasn't able to deliver the letter to the Queen because of some ongoing war. So, the agent hired a local courier to do it. The details surrounding this courier are unknown, and no one's even sure if the letter ever made it. However, Brisienna suggests that I pay a visit to Castle Daggerfall and learn the truth firsthand. She ends the conversation by saying that her position here has been compromised. Because of that, she's going to return to Cyrodiil and can't offer any more help on the adventure. So it was at this point in the story where I hit the first crux of my playthrough. I know, it's still early on. I genuinely didn't know how to proceed from here. As per Brisienna's instructions, I traveled to the three kingdoms and sought out each royal family. While some had side quests for me to embark on, none of them initiated the next steps of the main story. After doing some digging, I learned that Daggerfall's main quest is heavily reliant on its leveling system. In order for the next couple of quests to be initiated, I needed to be level 3. Saying that out loud, it doesn't sound super complicated, and honestly, it's not. Really, the big issue is how leveling works in Daggerfall and how it's tracked. Essentially, I need to increase my 3 primary skills, my 2 highest major skills, and my highest minor skill. There needs to be a total of 15 level increases among these 6 skills in order to reach the next overall player level. The one exception to this is ascending to level 2. That one only requires 2 skill increases, and it's pretty much a freebie to the player. While it's unfortunate that I'm only limited to 6 meaningful skills, the more tedious parts are what those skills are and how they're tracked. For being a knight, I had to raise longsword, blunt, axe, archery, shortsword, etiquette, and dodging. Now, leveling up melee combat is among these simpler skills to work on. All I had to do was swing my weapon at an enemy, and after resting, said skill may or may not go up. The issue was with the lower leveled combat skills, hits weren't landing. Making contact with an enemy is based around an RNG dice roll. The lower the level, the lower the odds are it actually landed. If they did land, odds were I'd die during the fight, as certain enemies were just too strong for that loadout. Furthermore, there's no way to see my overall experience bar. I was left in the dark with how far along I was to level 3, and with how close each skill was to increasing. Essentially, the leveling process required a lot of patience and understanding. 2 things that fed off of one another, and since I didn't have one, I therefore didn't have the other. Eventually, I let my frustrations get the better of me as I threw in the towel and switched to Daggerfall Unity. This, however, was the best thing that could have ever happened to this playthrough. I promise I'm only going to praise it for a minute or so, and then it's back to the story. Unity is incredible. It maintains the essence of Daggerfall, keeping most of the graphics and basic features the same. It does add more of a 3D element to the world, creating a more immersive and cohesive environment. What it really changes is the player's quality of life. The controls are altered to allow for a more modern gaming experience. The menus and bars are consolidated to make for easier navigation. The aspect ratio now accommodates modern PCs. The frame rate is incredibly smooth, and the game no longer hurts my eyes or makes me motion sick. While I can't confirm it, it sounds like there are additional sound effects and more music is used in Unity. If enemies aren't affiliated with one another, they'll end up attacking each other. I've stumbled onto rats, imps, bats, and skeletons all having a big brawl. The list of subtle changes goes on and on. Even though the game has been altered, it really does still feel like Daggerfall at its core, but with a more modern approach to gaming. From the get-go, you folks have been recommending Unity for my Daggerfall experience. I'm kicking myself that I'm only using it now, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's looking to play this game as well. As an aside, there are times where the game does sort of feel like a Minecraft mod, and it's something I can't really get out of my head. Hopefully I didn't ruin it for anyone, but yeah, I just felt the need to call that out. Alright, back to the matter at hand. Earlier, I mentioned that my character's class and stats get altered a bit. I went from a knight to creating a custom class. My primary skills were Longblade, Running, and Critical Strike. My major skills were Blunt, Medical, and Dodging. Then, my minor skills were Shortblade, Archery, Axe, Hand-to-Hand, Jumping, and Swimming. I pumped my additional attribute points into Strength, Agility, and Endurance. Then I switched my reflexes to high. With these changes, plus how smooth Unity makes the whole experience, I flew out of Privateer's hold, met with Lady Brisienna, and reached level 3 in no time. After returning to the city of Daggerfall and planning my accommodations at the local inn, I was approached by another courier. They handed me yet another letter, and this time it was from the Princess of Wayrest. It read, "Dear Bard, my eyes and ears abroad say that you are interested in the fate of a certain letter. Any emperor should not be so careless, nor should a queen. You really should come visit me in Castle Wayrest. I have some interesting tidbits that I am sure you would enjoy hearing. Signed, Morgiah, Princess of Wayrest. Finally, after hours of trying to hit level 3, I was able to continue with the main story. So, interestingly, if you recall my conversation with Brisienna, she mentioned that it wasn't safe to wander around Daggerfall at night. Having arrived at sundown countless times, to which nothing has ever happened, I never took her seriously. However, this was when I finally encountered Lysandas's ghostly army. Aggressive specters roamed the streets and chased me back into the inn. Thinking I could try my luck, the ghosts ended up slaughtering my character. I officially learned my lesson to not travel here in the nighttime. This, however, would not be my last encounter with them. In any case, setting my sights on the city of Wayrest, I traveled to the eastern side of the Western Kingdom, I know, confusing, and approached the castle. Entering the keep, I gained an audience with Morgiah, and she gave me the lowdown. The princess asked if I was trying to track down the Emperor's letter. Since she knows everything about everyone in the Iliac Bay, she happens to have information regarding that note. However, it comes at a price, and Morgiah says that the task she needs me to do isn't for the faint of heart. Accepting these conditions, the princess hands me a letter of her own. She wants me to take it to a place called Scourg Barrow in the Dragontail Mountains. This ancient crypt is home to a high-level sorcerer, nicknamed the King of Worms. Whatever else lies in the dungeon has no clue that I'm coming. I'll likely be attacked, and even after delivering the letter, my safety isn't guaranteed. The only other details that Morgiah offers me are that if I see the rift at Scourg Barrow, I've gone too far, and she needs a response delivered back to her in 1 month's time. Understanding the assignment, I left the castle and sneakily peered at the letter. It read, "King of Worms, I agree to your terms. I will give you my first, and you will exert your influence on the King of Firsthold on Somerset Isle. Only you can let him speak with his dead son. For that, he would even marry Nulfaga. Signed, M." Right now, I obviously have no context as to what any of this means, but perhaps with the delivery, it'll start to make more sense. Plus, the note is simply a means to an end for my own personal objective. Fast traveling to Scourg Barrow, the large keep is the only structure around. Heading on inside, the second dungeon crawl of the game begins. The first room of the barrow has about a half dozen coffins lined up on the walls. Interacting with them, the lids lift open and 2 of them have secret passages. Hopping into the northern one, I quickly got a feel for this dungeon's difficulty. I proceeded to have my teeth kicked in by a group of mummies over and over again. So, deciding to try the passage on the western side, this was the correct pathway to the King of Worms. However, the trials and tribulations didn't end with the mummies. The next chamber over contained a duo of zombies. At my current level with my current gear, they were really tough opponents. Most of the time, all it took was 2 to 3 hits for them to defeat me. 1v1, I barely stood a chance, so with a 2v1, my hopes were extremely low. While I hate running from a fight, it is a legitimate strategy, especially in the earlier Elder Scrolls games. The Unity tutorial even mentions that with some encounters, you're just better off fleeing, as dying won't do you any good. So, breaking some ankles, I dodged the undead and took the first doorway on the western wall. After some trial and error, I learned which ways to go and which areas to avoid. For example, at the end of that hallway, I veered north and spotted a huge fissure in the earth. This was the rift that I was told to avoid. It contains scorpions, skeletons, vampires, and I'm sure there are many more terrifying baddies here. All of the aforementioned ones are relatively tough enemies, and vampires are way out of my league. So, for my next attempt, I veered south at the intersection and situated myself in some of the natural caverns. After some more trial and error, I eventually found the King of Worms' court. Honestly, looking back, it really wasn't that hard to get to. You can probably do it within 30 seconds of entering the dungeon. It's just all about knowing where to go and which enemies to skip. As for the court itself, well, it was actually pretty intimidating. There were all sorts of terrifying creatures here. Liches, necromancers, vampires, undead. All of them were non-hostile, but I couldn't help but think about Morgiah's words. Would they turn on me as soon as my business here was concluded? Well, it was time to find out. The King of Worms was standing at the back of the room on a slightly raised platform. Speaking with him, his words were brief. He simply said, "Very good," and that if his servants didn't reward me with death on the way out, he'd like for me to deliver a letter back to Morgiah. The king was oddly polite, and it made the encounter even more off-putting. Moment of truth, I backed out of the conversation, and lo and behold, none of the NPCs in here came for my throat. The king's, quote, loyal servants likely just referred to the undead that I had already encountered. Wanting to sneak a peek at this new letter, all it said was, "Princess, done." signed King of Worms. Again, not a whole lot of context. Regardless, backtracking my way out of here and avoiding the enemies still wasn't an issue. Really, the biggest thing was how I was going to escape the barrow. Since I had dropped in through one of the coffins, I had no way of getting back up. However, after a bit of research, I learned about a little bone that the devs threw to the players. Right by the hole in the coffin, there's a banner on the wall that, when activated, gives the player temporary levitation. Using it, I was able to escape Scourg Barrow and return to Wayrest. Now, remember, with these quests, time is of the essence, especially if they give you a short limit, like 1 month. That was something that initially went right over my head. When I went to interact with Princess Morgiah, nothing would happen. I couldn't understand why at first, and then I remembered her strict deadline. If I hadn't saved before heading to the Dragontail Mountains, that would have been it for my playthrough. I would have been locked out from the rest of the main quest. Thankfully, I had saved before heading into Scourg Barrow, so this time I made sure to cut down on that travel time by as much as possible. Because I knew where to go, I was in and out of the dungeon in a matter of minutes. In total, it only took me 16 days to complete the quest, and upon interacting with Morgiah, she was more than happy to uphold her end of the bargain. The princess was ecstatic with how the exchange had gone and claimed that she'd be the queen of Firsthold, although she's sure her engagement will be a long one. So there's our context, I suppose. As for the Emperor's letter, she soon reveals some precious details. The letter was stolen from Queen Obki by the Thieves Guild. Then, the Orc warlord, Gortwog, bought it off of the faction. As for why the Emperor sent the letter to her, Morgiah isn't really sure. King Gothrid, the son of Lysandus, isn't as loyal to the Empire as his father was. Gothrid is Obki's husband, so maybe there's some connection there, maybe there isn't. The princess suggests that I start by getting on good terms with Minisera, Gothrid's mother and Lysandus' widow. However, in order to feel the situation out, she thinks it's best that I approach someone of lower status first before I schmooze up to the Queen Mother. Interestingly, while this objective is a part of the main questline, it's deemed as an optional pathway. Learning about the nature of that letter and its intent isn't required for beating the main story, but it is something that I'd like to look into anyways, as it does shed light on the plot. Fast traveling to Daggerfall, I was very quickly approached by another courier. He was a messenger from Wayrest, and the letter was more so an announcement. King Aedweir and Queen Brisienna have decreed that Morgiah, Princess of Wayrest, is engaged to Carudil, the King of Firsthold in the Somerset Isle. While this may or may not play a role in the events to come, my sights were set on Daggerfall's royal court. After a little housekeeping, depositing gold and selling off loot, I made my way to the castle. Surprisingly, the next quest giver was Queen Obki herself. Maybe through her, I could get closer to Minisera, like Morgiah suggested. Obki's request was plain and simple. Gothrid's grandmother, Nulfaga, has recently lost her mind. She isolates herself in the Hrothgarian mountains and spends her waking hours running dangerous experiments. She hasn't been heard from in a while, and Obki would like to know if she's still insane or if she's even still alive. The castle Minisera lives in is guarded by horrors, and since many are afraid to venture there, she asks if I'd be willing to champion for her. Saying yes, Obki gives me the details. The castle is called Shedungeon, and she'd like for me to go there and return in no more than 150 days. The queen bids me farewell, and I set off for my next adventure. Of course, heading to the Hrothgarian mountains, I completely forgot about travel settings, and it takes me 77 days to get to that region. As it stands, that's over half of my allotted time. Luckily, I was a little more perceptive on the way back, and still had plenty of time to work with. As for Shedungeon the dungeon, it can actually be cleared in a matter of moments. Upon going on inside, the very first door that I saw was magically locked. Without the means of opening it, I had to take the long way around. However, beside the door is a banner, and interacting with it, it says, "Command me and entry shall be yours." I'm prompted to type something in, but as it stands, I don't know what. If I did know, that doorway would have led me right to Nulfaga. However, for the sake of my Daggerfall experience, and to literally gain more experience, I decided to brave the dungeon. Shedungeon was a lot easier than Scourg Barrow. I mostly fought with human enemies such as mages and battle mages. They ended up casting a lot of silencing spells on my character. If I was actively using magic, this would have been a more difficult crawl. But because my knight hybrid has nothing to do with the arcane arts, I brushed off their attacks and swung for the fences. A few successful hits were all it took to bring each enemy down, and they weren't doing a number on my health like the undead did. After some meandering, crossing over a bridge, and a bit of exploration, I soon landed at Nulfaga's court. The Queen Mother was on the upper platform, and while she herself wasn't hostile, she was looking a little worse for wear. What's more, her dialogue didn't make a lot of sense. She said, choosing out few words most horrible, let none them read. Verses frame which with and other spells like terrible curses heaven. Curse oblivion, my boy is dead, and let Tamriel tremble until he and I findeth peace denied. Shut up the door to his tomb and my home. What she's saying isn't really coherent. However, the part I think I understood was when she said, my boy is dead. This could be referring to Lysandus, as he did die somewhat recently, and his death was initially what caused Nulfaga to spiral. Well, she's alive, but she's still no better than what Obki described. So, leaving Shadungeon, I used the secret passage this time. Activating the statue of the Lich on the lower level, the same prompt as before pops up. Technically, the answer to the riddle, or whatever this is, was mentioned by Nulfaga in her rant. Typing shut up, as in shut up the door to his tomb and my home, the door opens and I'm free to leave in an instant. Now, in classic Daggerfall fashion, upon my return to the castle, I wasn't able to interact with Obki. It took me a moment, and then I slapped my forehead and remembered her time limit. So, making the adjustment to arrive as soon as possible, I ended up getting to Daggerfall in the middle of the night, and the city gates were closed. This was when I heard one of the most terrifying sound bites in the game. That was the ghost of King Lysandus. That's as much as I can interact with him at the moment, but let's just say I didn't have a pleasant time with his ghostly army. So, making the correct adjustments, again, this time I made it to the city in a timely manner and while the sun was still up. Obki was more than happy to engage with me and the quest was able to close out. The queen confessed that she didn't think I'd be successful. Even though Nulfaga is still crazy, Obki is relieved to hear that she's still alive. For her end of the bargain, the queen rewards me with an enchanted left pauldron. While this quest doesn't seem all that important or relevant, it opens the door for the next chapter of the story. In turn, that ends up shedding light on Daggerfall's complex plot.